Welcome back to the Bookly podcast for this week's episode of The Coddling of the American Mind by, I should have had their names. I want to say it's like Greg Lukianoff and what was his name? Jonathan Haidt. Yes, I believe those are the authors. And to start off with this episode of the podcast, I'm going to preface this and just say I don't like nonfiction books like this. Is this nonfiction? Fiction. Nonfiction is true, right? Yes. Nonfiction, self-help. I don't know how you would classify this because I do enjoy nonfiction books. Like I enjoy history books. I enjoy, really just history is my main go-to for nonfiction. Books like this, I can't get into them. And I'll go into it a little bit more as to why in this episode. But I want to preface this episode by really just saying that, for anybody who absolutely loved The Coddling of the American Mind, I'm not that person. I did not like this book. And it's not that I hated this book, but it just is not my cup of tea. And I think moving forward, I'm going to really minimize the type of books like this that I read because I feel like you can get a lot out of reading and a lot out of books without having to read books that just tell you things. And I think that's my biggest critique about books like this, again, is that it's kind of my critique with education in general. Honestly, it's this idea of just telling people things and then that's it. And I feel like that's what these books have become. I feel like a lot of these self-help, a lot of these, modern philosophy books is the way that I would call them. Because they're definitely not like old philosophy books, but modern philosophy books are now just a telling you things, telling you the way that it is type of book. And it's the same problem that I have with education. They just tell you the way that it is, and you're just supposed to accept that. Whereas I think that a lot of the true thinkers in history wrote in a way that allowed you to kind of see both points of view, maybe criticize things, come to your own conclusions. And a lot of that has to just do with, I don't know. I don't know what that has to do with. To me, I just attribute that to kind of a higher plane of writing, if that makes sense. I feel like the barrier to entry to writing nowadays is so low that books like this can get published and get promoted, and that's great. And this book is not terrible. Like I'm not going to say that it can't help people. This book can help people. But again, I just don't think that this would have made it through the crucible of, the 1800, mid 1900s. I don't know, early 1900s. For instance, like I can't imagine Dostoevsky or Orwell or any of these writers. I mean, who did I just read? I just read what was the book that I just read? I read East of Eden by Steinbeck, writers like that. I can't imagine any of them being able to write and publish and promote a book like this back in the day. It just never would have happened. The barrier to entry for writing was so high that you had to create something that really could resonate with people. And also, books like East of Eden, books like 1984, Animal Farm, books like, what's the other one that we've read this year by Dostoevsky? What about Murder? Crime and Punishment. Oh my gosh. Sorry. My brain is all over the place. But books like that, what makes those books so great is that they teach you lessons, but at the same time, there are characters in the book that give you opposing viewpoints. There are characters that every character has opposition. There are characters that, battle, I would like intellectually battle against each other is the way that I would put it. And that's what makes kind of the ideas really pop off the page and the ideas of the book really worth something, because they have to kind of go through that crucible through the medium of story. So, the story is what kind of refines the ideas. Whereas a book like, and I'm not trying to pick on The Coddling of the American Mind, because this is true for a lot of the other books that I've read this year like this, but we're just going to use The Coddling of the American Mind because it's all just kind of it's all coming together for me. Like my thought process on books like this are all coming together. And books like this just don't really have to go through that refiner's fire of kind of cross-examination through a story. Instead, you can pick and choose anecdotes, pick and choose stories, pick and choose news entries, pick and choose, examples and studies and things like that you'd like in order to prove your narrative. And because of that ability to just pick and choose and sift through whatever, the entire body of study and choose the ones that fit your narrative, you never really have to, like I said, never really have to overcome anything with your main idea. Whereas in contrast, and the reason why I think that this is becoming clear to me is because I just finished East of Eden. So I cranked through East of Eden and I cranked through this book both in a week. I read both of them this week. And I'm going to do an entire episode on East of Eden, but I loved East of Eden. It was phenomenal. It was so well done. And I know that that's considered one of the greatest books of all time. It's in the top 100 books that everybody should read on just about everybody's list. John Steinbeck calls it, kind of his magnum opus. That is his book. So I understand that comparing any book to that book is going to be hard, but in East of Eden, they cover very complex, very, I would say fundamental human nature, very complex aspects of human nature, fundamental human nature. And they're able to do that in a way that you can basically see both sides of the argument. It really peels back a lot of the arguments against and for those themes. And, Steinbeck is able to use characters that, are vastly different to show examples of, why things are that way. This idea that good and evil exists in both of us, that's very prevalent within Steinbeck. And he does that through the characters in the book and the story that's told. And after reading that story, it all kind of makes sense. And you can see, it's not a real life example, but you can see a literary example of the point that he's trying to prove. The Coddling of the American Mind has a lot of really good points, but ultimately that's really what they are. They're just points. They're points, and it's the way that it's structured is point, study, opinion, point, study, opinion, point, study, opinion. And there's never really this refiner's fire of opposing characters and development that go into these ideas. And coming at it from a critical lens as well, you just know that the authors also are able, and just like any other book, every author's able to pick and choose the stories, the data, the studies that they need in order to prove their point. So it just, I don't know, it doesn't feel as well developed for me. And so because of that, I just don't enjoy it as much. I feel like I don't reflect on it as much. It doesn't stick with me as long. And although some of these stories and some of the what would you call those? The conclusions, some of the stories and some of the conclusions of The Coddling of the American Mind are very good, and I agree with wholeheartedly. I still just don't have the same connection to the overall purpose and theme of this book than I do from a 1984 Crime and Punishment, Animal Farm, East of Eden, even more modern books like Ordinary Grace. That book really stuck with me, and I think about that book from time to time. This is something that I don't feel like I'm ever going to really reflect back on. And maybe that's just me personally, because maybe there are other people that really connect to a book like this. But personally, I expected to connect to books like this more than I actually do. When starting my reading journey, I fully expected myself to be almost exclusively a nonfiction reader. I thought that was definitely going to be the path that I most connected with, because I like data, I like facts. I was a math and economics major in college, and I listened to podcasts like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and all of the typical bro podcasts, I would call them. And so I kind of expected myself to really like these kinds of books, and it's not sticking with me. And there's got to be something between there's definitely something to that, because I do enjoy this format in the podcast. So I have listened to both of these authors on Joe Rogan before, and I've listened to a lot of the topics that have been discussed on this on both, on multiple different podcasts. And so a lot of the stuff in this book was not new to me. And so maybe that's another reason why I didn't really enjoy this book, is because I felt like it was almost a review from things that I had heard previously, because Joe loves this kind of stuff. He loves all these stories. He loves all of these, historical facts and things like that. And so that's a large part of his podcast. And I know that there are other podcasters that do something very similar to that. And so because of that, I felt like it was all very familiar, and it just never really was very interesting. I had heard all these viewpoints before, and the book didn't really add anything of value to that. So if you're somebody who's spent a lot of time listening to Joe Rogan, and that's where you heard about this book, or somebody who's listened to, I don't know, Jordan Peterson or Lex Friedman or any of the other people who have individuals like this on their podcast, then reading this book is going to essentially just confirm everything you've heard on the podcast. There's not a whole lot more that has been added in here. Not to say that I didn't like it, but again, it was boring. I didn't really get into it. I wanted it to end the entire time. I just kept looking and being like, how much longer do I have in this? How much longer do I have in this? How much longer do I have in this? I don't think I took a single note in this book. It was just, I don't know. It just wasn't very interesting. So that is my overall opinion of this book. We'll dive into some of the things that I did like and didn't like here a little bit deeper. But I do want, for anybody who doesn't know what this book is, the title of this book, The Coddling of the American Mind, pretty much sums up this book. So that's why I didn't read it right off the bat here. But I'll go ahead and read the description of this book for those of you who have no idea what we're talking about. But the generation now coming of age has been taught three great untruths. Their feelings are always right. They should avoid pain and discomfort, and they should look for faults in others and not in themselves. These three great untruths are part of a larger philosophy that sees young people as fragile creatures who must be protected and supervised by adults. But despite the good intentions of the adults who impart them, the great untruths are harming kids by teaching them the opposite of ancient wisdom and the opposite of modern psychological findings on grit, growth, and anti-fragility. The result is rising rates of depression, anxiety, along with endless stories of college campuses torn apart by moralistic divisions and mutual recriminations. This is a book about how we got here. The First Amendment expert Greg Lukianoff and social psychologist Jonathan Haidt take us on a tour of social trends stretching back to the 1980s that have produced the confusion and conflict on campuses today, including the loss of unsupervised playtime, the birth of social media, all during a time of rising political polarization. This is a book about how to fix the mess. The culture of safety and the intolerance of opposing viewpoints has left many young people anxious and unprepared for adult life, with devastating consequences for them, for their parents, for the companies that will soon hire them, and for the democracy that is already pushed to the brink of violence over the growing political divisions. Lukianoff and Haidt offer a comprehensive set of reforms that will strengthen young people and institutions, allowing us all to reap the benefits of diversity, including viewpoint diversity. This is a book for anyone who is confused about what's happening on college campuses today, or has children, or is concerned about the growing inability of Americans to live and work and cooperate across party lines. It has a 4.24 on Goodreads, and overall, it was the description of this book that really caught my attention, because, if you listen to the entire description and you're not interested about this book, then, I don't know, because I don't know if you and I are on the same wavelength here, because honestly, that is a lot of what worries me as an individual, as a parent, as a citizen of the United States. I think that these are all issues that no matter what side of the aisle you are on, you kind of look around and you see, holy cow, we are extraordinarily divided as a country. And then on top of that, you have anybody that's dealt with, I hate to say this because I'm not that old, but young people coming out of college and just this expectation of entitlement and all of those things that come along with that. it does worry me. I feel like kids are, I mean, and Joe Rogan has said this quite a bit of times. It's that old adage. I know we've said it here on this podcast, but it's the, easy times create weak men create hard times create strong men create easy times create weak men. And I think we're, definitely within that cycle, and we are just getting pushed through the, and again, it's this idea that we had it so good that we created almost too much easy times for individuals, or too much kind of safety for kids, that now it is creating weak men or weak children who are unprepared to enter into society. And so again, this is all things that really do concern me, especially as a new father, really concern me as a citizen of the United States, really concern me as somebody who's just looking at this upcoming political election between, this is Joe Biden and Donald Trump round 2. And I look at things and I just don't know, how we are going to handle all of this. On top of that, for, anybody who's watching the news, I mean, this is a pretty, what's the word, poignant or pretty well-timed episode of the podcast, because right now, I mean, there are campuses that across the United States that are completely shut down due to these protests in which, people have essentially been, fearing, I don't know if they're fearing for their lives, but ultimately fearing for their safety, because, their voice is not able to be heard on these college campuses that they have sung so far towards the, pro-Palestine side of things, that now we're kind of pushing up against the, the anti-Israel, I know they call themselves like anti-Zionists, but it's definitely, I mean, coming into the more anti-Semitic side of things. And there are, I mean, entire swaths of people on college campuses who don't feel safe anymore because of, the viewpoints of one side of the aisle. And that's not, one side of the political aisle. That's one side of the aisle of what's going on in the Middle East right now. So again, I really, really liked the premise of this book. It touches on a lot of things that like I said, a lot of things that I really do think about and that really worry me about this country. So, and my society, my family, a lot of things that I really do think about. So ultimately, I thought I was going to love this book. I thought this book was going to be everything that I was looking for, and I came away feeling a little bit empty. I came away hoping that there would have just been a little bit more. And I don't know if that's, again, I don't know if I'm just being a little bit harsh comparing it to some of the great books of all time, but it just isn't stacking up against those books. So one of the things that I will say positively about this book is that, unlike a lot of other, I would call them modern philosophy books, this book gives concrete things that can be done in order to, concrete theory, I guess theories and ideas given by the authors that they think can kind of steer the ship back into in a better direction. So I really do like that, because one of the things that I do hate about self-help books is I hate when you get through one of those books and you're like, oh, well, I'm glad we're screwed, but it would have been nice to know how we can correct the ship. And that's one thing that I did really, really like about this book. At the end of every section of this book, they give a kind of, this is what should be done part of the book. And at the very end of the podcast, I want to go through some of my favorite, this is what should have been done, their solutions side of the book. And so I'm going to go through, I picked out 6 specific things from their solutions that I think were very good. And I really liked those. So I did really like that. But the other thing that I really, really liked was their idea on cognitive behavioral therapy. So one of the authors, Jonathan Haidt, comes from a psychological, what is that called? It's in here. I always get those words mixed up. Social psychologist. I always think psychological, but then I always think like, oh, that's a psychological thriller. Can't be the right word. Sorry. But a social psychologist is his background. So he comes from that side of things. And one of their big theories about this book is that ultimately a lot of this softness, a lot of this weakness that has been kind of perpetuated throughout society can be fixed through cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for short, and I abbreviate throughout the entire book. But CBT is something that I like wholeheartedly believe in, and I really do. I personally have used that just as, a way to reduce anxiety, manage situations. And it's something that, I've talked to my wife about, who struggled with anxiety and all those kinds of things. So the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, I felt like I could really get behind. And I do think that's a very powerful tool. And so I wanted to go into that a little bit more as to what cognitive behavioral therapy is, because it comes up quite a bit in this book. So according to the Association of the United States Behavioral Association or something like that, I think that's what it was. They say that cognitive behavioral therapy is a form of psychological treatment that has been demonstrated to be effective for a range of problems, including depression, anxiety disorders, alcohol and drug problems, marital problems, eating disorders, and severe mental illness. So it runs the gambit, basically. Anything that has to do with mental issues or anything like that, this CBT has been known to help, not cure. And I want to make that very abundant, because that was definitely some of the negative reviews on Goodreads. People are like, CBT's all right, but can't cure depression. But that's not what they're claiming, and that's also not what the Academy of Behavioral whatever of the United States doesn't claim either. It's there to help. It's demonstrated to be effective, not cure. But numerous research studies suggest that CBT leads to significant improvement in functioning and quality of life. It is important to emphasize that advances in CBT have been made in the basics, both research and clinical practices. And CBT is based on several core principles. These are the 3 core principles, and then we'll go into what CBT actually is. But it is: psychological problems are based in part on faulty or unhelpful ways of thinking, are based in part on learned patterns of unhelpful behavior, and people suffering from psychological problems can learn better ways of coping with them, thereby relieving their symptoms and becoming more effective in their lives. So again, it's all about just kind of the lead up to anxiety, depression. What was the list? Anxiety, depression, alcohol and drug use problems, marital problems, eating disorders. And ultimately, the idea of CBT is that it's a thought action, or it's a thought behavior action problem, and that it all stems from initially, solving the problem of what you're thinking and how you're thinking about the problem. And that if you work on that, then that trickles down and eventually affects your actions and affects your behaviors. So I do believe that it all starts with your thoughts. You're not just anxious, but you think about something, and then that is what makes you become anxious. And same thing with depressed. Depressed people don't just have depression for no reason, but it's a hyperfixation. It's a thinking about something specifically that leads you to, feel depressed. So cognitive behavior therapy usually involves efforts to change thinking patterns. These strategies might include learning to recognize one's distortions and thinking that are creating problems, and then reevaluating them in the light of reality, gaining a better understanding of the behavior and motivations of others, using problem-solving skills to cope with difficult situations, learning to develop a greater sense of confidence in one's own ability. And then CBT treatment also usually involves efforts to change behavioral patterns. These might include facing one's fears instead of avoiding them, using role-playing to prepare for potentially problematic interactions with others, learning to calm one's mind and relax one's body. So again, I think that portion of the book was gold. I really do. I think that there are a lot of people in this world that I almost feel like I don't want to say disorder, but the claiming of it's like I don't know how to put this without sounding like a complete douche, but which is, I don't know why I try, because I know that in this episode I'm gonna sound like a complete douche, but like the kind of the oppression Olympics is the way that I've heard it be called on other podcasts, which is probably the worst way of putting it. But, like people try to point out, all of the problems that they have and try to feel marginalized and try to, rationalize why they might not be successful or might not be where they want to be. And, now I feel like on TikTok and on Instagram stories, I see all of these. I see like this huge trend of people being like, oh, I have not Asperger's, because Asperger's is like an actual disorder, but like, I don't know, like I have, what is that? Autism. There's like this race for everybody to become autistic. I don't know if anybody else has seen that. It's like autism all of a sudden is like this next level disorder because anxiety and depression aren't trendy enough anymore. So now you have to one up everybody and be like, oh, I don't just have autism, or I don't just have anxiety and depression. I also am autistic. And so like, I feel like I don't know if anybody else's Instagram feed is like that, but that is my Instagram feed right now. Or not right now, but it was probably a month ago. And so because of that, I don't know, maybe I just have a warped sense of kind of the way that people deal with problems. Not that autism maybe falls in this category, but this idea that, people people look for anxiety and depression to use them as an excuse or crutch. And I feel like a lot of people do. And that's not to downplay people who actually suffer from anxiety and depression. And a lot of people who use anxiety and depression actually develop anxiety and depression because in using them like a crutch, just like the positive effects of CBT, the positive effects of being able to change your thoughts, affect your behavior, and then affect your actions, and eventually, start to overcome or curb some of that anxiety and depression. It works both ways. So if you, maybe start to say, oh, I have anxiety, I have depression, and that becomes your thought pattern, it works the other way too. CBT can not only be a positive effect on your life, but it can also have a negative effect on your life too. If you actively seek, or not actively seek, but you actively think about having more anxiety and having more depression, it will affect your behaviors, which will then eventually affect your actions and develop into an actual case of depression and anxiety. So again, I think that it's a very powerful tool, especially for kind of modern society, which I feel like anxiety and depression have become almost like an epidemic among people my age and younger, I would say. I feel like everybody that I know has that to some varying degree. And I think that this trickle down effect of the way that you think becomes the way that you behave. The way that you behave affects the way that you think. The way that you think and behave affect how you act and how you feel. I think that's amazing. And I think more people, if you focused on early thoughts, could change your behaviors and actions. So really, really liked that portion of the book. Again, there were things that I really did enjoy about this book, and there are things that I really, really did agree with in this book. So there were just a lot of other things that I didn't really like. So those are the two things that I would say I liked the most about this book. Again, that was actionable things within the book, and then this idea of CBT. I think that was the two most important things about this book. So I wanted to dive a little bit into the way that this book starts, the overall premise of this book, and then some of the criticisms, and then dive lastly into the solutions. So follow along here. But this book starts off with kind of this weird example of these two authors going to, I don't know, this was such a weird way to start off this book. First of all, hated it. So the book starts off with the two authors claiming that they go to some ancient philosopher, not so ancient philosopher, but this philosopher up in the mountains in Italy or something like that, I think, to go talk to him about, how to help today's youth or something. And they go to this philosopher, and it's got this made up name, and this philosopher tells them 3 things that they need to do in order to help today's youth. And those 3 things are What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings. And life is a battle between good people and evil people. And then they are like, psych, we never visited anybody. Don't those three things sound absolutely ridiculous? All three of those things sound ridiculous when coming from a monk living in the mountains in Italy. However, those three truths are what is being taught to us today. And I was like, what a weird way to start off a book. What? Like right off the bat, reading this book, I was like, what is going on? Like what editor was like, yes, that's the way to start it. Start it with a make-believe monk coming up with three ideas and then being like, psych, but those three ideas are real. I don't know. That's personal choice, I guess, but not a big fan of the way that book started out. So, but I don't know. But that was the overall theme of the book. Those three things are kind of ruining society right now, and it's leading towards kind of this weaker, kind of safety-obsessed generation that is both mentally and emotionally coddled, just like the title, and it's leading people for failure, and it's leading towards ultimately polarization and failure. So I wanted to dive into each one of these three things because that's the premise of the book. But first one, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. They say, essentially that's completely false. But that we've grown up in a society that's so obsessed with, making things 100% safe and not, this idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and that we should continue to push the envelope and push the edge a little bit, and that kids should be allowed to get hurt and learn and grow. Instead, it's, we want to avoid hurt and pain at all costs, because if it hurts, anything that doesn't kill you makes you weaker. That's such a weird way of putting it, but ultimately, yeah, that's the argument. It's that we've become a society obsessed with safety ultimately. And that's definitely true. I mean, there's the idea of helicopter parenting. There's the idea of, one of the phrases that I felt like summed this up a lot better than that. I don't know what to say. Than that weird ancient wisdom of the fake monk was this idea of prepare your children for the road, not the road for the children. Really liked the way that was put. That as a society, we've done that backwards. We're preparing the road for the children. We're preparing society for people. We're changing the way that schools work. So there's this no child left behind aspect of things. And now there's basically no way that a kid can fail throughout high school. And then, kids get to college, and essentially if you're willing to show up, you can get a college degree. And instead of preparing kids for the tests, instead we're changing the tests so that any kid can pass. And, it's kind of this idea that in reality, we're just harming kids for the future. You get these people that are just completely unprepared because everything has been basically shaped around them always. And I think I think that's true. I think more people in life would benefit from failure. I'll go out on a limb and say that. I have failed so much in my life. I have failed I've failed in my childhood dreams of going to the Olympics. I've failed in business. I've failed in school before. I failed in, in work. I've failed in, there have been failures in basically all aspects of my life. And as an individual, I think those have been some of the moments that I've grown the most. And reflecting on those moments, I don't look back on failures as negatives in my life at all. And in fact, most failures, I think, have helped me to become the person that I am today. And if you never learn to overcome failures as a kid, and you never learn to overcome failures and use them to your advantage later on in life, then when you fail your first time when you're 25, 30 years old, it's going to crush you. Again, learning to overcome failures is a skill. It's not a given. There are a lot of people that fail. There are a lot of people in life that fail in life and then just get stuck or, fall off the deep end and become alcoholics or, become homeless or whatever it is in their life, succumb to mental disorders or whatever it is. There are a lot of people that just can't fail and use that to their advantage. And so it's not a given that everybody can do that. And so not teaching your kids to do that at an early age is not beneficial. Like, you're not doing them a service, keeping them from failing. In fact, you're doing them a disservice, in my opinion. Kids should learn to fail, learn the consequences of failure, and then also learn the benefits of failure, because I think failure is a good thing in a lot of places. It gives you an opportunity to respond, learn, grow. I think failure is one of the best teachers. And I think that's true in all aspects of life. I was talking to one of my jiu-jitsu coaches once, and they were saying that there are certain moves that they will never, ever get caught in anymore. And it's because those are the moves that they got caught in at a tournament. And they were like, those are the moves that I just are cemented in my brain now. And it's because that failure to them, that them getting caught in a submission in that tournament, that was what that's what got them to the point of never getting caught in that again. Like, it was the failure that ultimately led to all the successes later throughout their jiu-jitsu journey. But if you don't fail, then you never have that. So it is important to fail. So that was the first point. And again, they talk a lot about parenting in that section, a lot about helicopter parenting, and just the way that times have changed. Kids don't run around and play outside anymore. Like, parents are just so worried about people getting kidnapped. Where I think it was I have that actually in a note. I want to pull that up. I think it was in, what was that? The Better Angels of Our Nature. I have it here. People are so worried, because this was one of the points they talk about, like this idea of free range kids. I've heard that multiple times in multiple books, but there's an entire movement about free range kids and just letting your kids run wild. Not run wild, but allowing your kids to grow and experience the world and not have to be right next to them and not always constantly being worried about them as they go, through a city or through the woods or whatever it is. So, I remember the statistics in this because they talk about free range kids in this, but in The Better Angels of Our Nature, he also talks about free range kids at some point in the book as well. And he talks about, again, the unlikely nature of kids getting kidnapped and murdered and all that kind of stuff, and how we need to allow kids to go out into the world and experience the world without constantly being worried about kids getting kidnapped. Because the actual statistic is that your child is 20 times more likely to be drowned than kidnapped and 40 times more likely to die in a car crash. The likelihood of your kid getting kidnapped is greater than 1 in a million. So I think a lot of people, including myself, allow my kids to ride in cars on an almost daily basis. And yet, I do have that fear still. I have that fear that my kids are going to get kidnapped. I remember the other day we were walking through, I want to say it was like Al's Sporting Goods or something like that. And I turned around and I couldn't find my kid. And my heart just dropped in my stomach. And we're Al's Sporting Goods in Idaho Falls, Idaho, super safe. I don't want to say super safe, but a pretty safe neighborhood. I'd be shocked if there were any non-familiar kidnappings in the past, 20 years or something like that, but that was the first thing that came to my mind is, holy crap, where's my kid? I don't want them to get kidnapped. Whereas I never once think about them driving in cars. Again, it's just this whole this shift in your mind. Again, it's this CBT that I need to kind of go through myself in order to kind of gain a little bit more trust in my kids' freedom. So again, that was an interesting part of the book as well. The second point that they talk about is always trust your feelings. And again, that's the fake wisdom. So that's supposed to be the falsehood that they're addressing. But this idea of always trusting your feelings, how that's what people are told nowadays. Our feelings over everything. That your feelings matter more than anything. And in this section, he talks a lot about, the social justice warrior side of the aisle. He talks a lot about, microaggressions, a lot about how people are, shutting themselves. He talks a lot about kind of campus events that have happened and how people are protesting and eventually, forcing campuses to remove speakers out of campus events because of the way that they feel, because they feel attacked based on the ideas of other people. And so he talks about how that's ultimately just a net negative, and that we should not be living our lives based on how we're feeling, but we should actually be living our lives trying to, live through a kind of battling of ideas and not allow feelings to take us away from competitive ideas. Again, all things that I agree with here. So I thought that section was pretty good. This is a little bit where he starts to lose me, is kind of towards the ends of this section. I don't know if I want to go into that right now. No, I'm not going to go into that. But there was, towards the end of this section, this always trust your feelings section, this is kind of where he starts to lose me. The book definitely has a more left-leaning bias to it. Even though a lot of the ideas that I feel like are talked about in this book are very nowadays, this book was written almost 10 years ago. So 2024, 2024, looking at this book, it almost seems like it was very right-leaning is the way that I would call it. However, he definitely comes at it from a very left-leaning perspective. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a sec. But so this whole middle section is all about feelings. Again, this, as Ben Shapiro would say, facts don't care about your feelings section. You just need to kind of get both sides of the argument, regardless of how you're feeling, regardless of whether or not you feel attacked, that ideas are not violence, that violence is violence, ideas are not violence. And it's important that we have both ranging of ideas, because it's the kind of hearing and, vetting of both ideas that we come up with the actual truth. One thing that he did talk about in the section that I really, really like was that he said that more often than not, the truth lies very slightly away from center. So he said sometimes the right has, slightly to the left of right has the truth. Sometimes the very slightly to the left has the truth. However, he says, rarely is truth ever found in the extremes. And so if you only ever hear one side of the argument and you're pushed further and further down the line, you're always going to be moving away from truth. Whereas, regardless of whether or not you find yourself on the right or on the left, that there's truth on both sides of the middle. There's truth on slightly to the left and slightly to the right. And it's important that you hear both sides of any argument, because you never know where the truth lies, whether it lies slightly to the left or slightly to the right. And so it's important that you hear both sides, so that it's this battle of ideas that really, moves society towards truth. So again, I thought that was very good. Again, I feel like that's a very right-leaning argument nowadays, but I don't know. Maybe it's just because I hear it from right-leaning individuals that I think that. So, and number 3 was the third kind of false truth that they start this book out with is life is a battle between good people and evil people. And it's this idea that there's an us versus them always. There's a Republicans versus Democrats. There's a Trump supporters versus Biden supporters. There's a, white versus black. There's a, rich versus poor. There's always two different sides of any argument, and that you make the argument about the individuals. They're evil. If they oppose your ideas, it's because they are at their core evil, and it has nothing to do with the ideas. It has to do with the individual. And so again, completely agree with that. I think all three of those problems are very prevalent problems, and I think they're, ever since writing this book, I can only see them becoming more and more prevalent. I feel like people are starting to become, more and more split. I think the idea that, Trump supporters are evil and that Biden supporters are evil is very prevalent nowadays. I think that the idea is that, words and ideas can be harmful, and that words and ideas are violence. I think that is all over campuses and all over companies at this point. Now you have all these, DEI and all these, crazy, things that it's just insane at this point. And then, this, helicopter parenting side of things is definitely not getting any better. So all 3 points of those books, all 3 points of their argument, I actually really, really agree with. Overall, I think the premise of all 3 of those is very good. And I liked the structure. There were definitely some quirkiness at the beginning of the book with the way that they set it up, but ultimately I thought that those things were good. So that was the book, and that was kind of what was taught in the book. And again, I liked it. I don't think that I just don't think that these ideas can be as well developed without going through kind of the crossfire of examination, which is why I actually enjoyed, I think, their podcasts and their interviews more than I've enjoyed the book. And the reason is because books like this, like I said, just provide information without any cross-examination. Whereas, books like classical books provide ideas and then cross-examine them through the other characters within the story. And podcasts do something very similar. In podcasts, the authors of this book can get together and promote their ideas, promote their studies, promote their findings, and then it can be cross-examined, and different viewpoints can be brought into each of these arguments through the podcast host, through alternative guests. And so I think that I've actually enjoyed the ideas that are perpetuated in this book more as through the format of podcasts than I have through the format of this book. So if you're somebody who's like, man, this book sounds really, really interesting, but should I read it? I would almost suggest listening to them on podcasts rather than reading this book, because I felt like I got more out of the podcasts than I did out of the book by far. Again, it's that cross-examination of ideas that really, I think, really brings forth the best of the book and the best, like the most important pieces of the book, and really refines their ideas. So as far as things that I didn't like about the book, now there's one review here that I do want to read because it kind of nailed one of the aspects that I just didn't love about this book, one part that just made me roll my eyes pretty big. And so I want to read this review just word for word because this guy summed it up just perfect. And so I just wanted to go ahead and read that. And it is, I didn't get this guy's name, so sorry if this is your review. I'm not giving you credit, but it's on Goodreads. This is a 1-star review for the book. He said, "There's also an effort on page 220 to make the concept of social justice palatable by defining it by what is actually just an aspect of simple justice, equal opportunity. The authors accept there's a bad kind of social justice. They claim that the good kind of social justice is just one that means equal opportunity. Except equal opportunity only matters because it affects individuals, thus making it a matter of justice. Full stop. Justice, not social justice. At best, social justice is a tautology, as there is a social element inherent to all justice because it exists to moderate human interactions. At worst, and most commonly, social justice is a Marxist bait and switch tactic for acquiring tyrannical power. Don't trust any effort to apologize for it and make it palatable. Social justice has no acceptable form." Now, I know that was very specific, but at one point, again, they basically bash on all the ideas of social justice. They bash on all the ideas of kind of this more progressive like segregation of ideas aspect of things. And then they go on to just apologize for that. And they're just like, well, some social justice is good, or, Donald Trump is really bad, or you know what I mean? So they take these ideas that are very, very logical. And it's almost like they just wanted to like walk a very fine line and not piss anybody off. They were trying to come up with these ideas, and they wanted to, basically critique education systems, critique modern society. But at the same time, they didn't want their critique to offend anybody, which I think is dumb to start off with. If you're going to make a critique of society, don't be afraid of who's offended. But it's almost like that's what their goal was. They were trying to appease both parties. So ultimately, I think a lot of the ideas in this book, like I said, lean pretty right side of the aisle. Again, it's a lot of things like, people need to be tougher, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, try to overcome and, use modern psychology to overcome anxiety and depression. Don't continue to just wallow in your depression and anxiety. It was a lot of, we need to hear lots of viewpoints, freedom of speech, all of those things that I feel like are very right leaning right now. In the past, they've been kind of more left social issues. However, right now I feel like they lean pretty right. And so because a lot of the ideas of the book lean right, they are constantly making excuses for kind of left-leaning social terms. Like they're constantly making excuses for kind of this idea of equity, this idea of like racial injustice, this idea of, what is that? Transsectional, like that transsectional racism, like, or not race, transsectional oppression. I don't know what that's called, but basically where like you have women and you have black women, and then you have women and you have African Americans, and now you have African American women. So I can't remember what that's called. But yeah, I mean, they're making excuses for social justice. At one point in the book, they basically just flat out apologize for like the studies and all of the ideas in the book. And they're like, just so that you guys know, neither of the authors have ever voted for Republican. We've been Democrats forever. Like they explicitly say that. They're like, we have never, ever been Republican. And so I feel like that is one thing that just took away from this book. Again, they tried so hard to just make it palatable for everybody that it waters it down. Instead, they should have just stuck to their guns. They should have covered the 3 topics that they were that they outlined, and they should have just let the chips fall where they may. Instead, again, they really did try to not make one side angry and not make the other side angry either. And so they kind of walked that fine line, and I felt like that detracted from the book overall. And it made some of the topics within the book almost feel very apologetic. I just didn't like that. Wasn't a huge fan. And then one of the other things that I really didn't like was this idea. One of their solutions to this book was that we need to pick the best people, or pick a good mix of people for the mission. So, they talk about diversity being important, but more specifically, they talk about the diversity of ideas being important. And so they talk about that in the lens of academia, and how, right now in academia, I think throughout all of academia, there's what they say, it's like a 4 or 5 to 1 spread of, left liberal leaning professors versus more right conservative leaning professors. For every 4 or 5 liberal professors, there's 1 conservative professor. And then if you go specifically into like the liberal arts, this side of things, so, that would be like he talks about in his field of study, psychology, that it is actually closer to 17 or 20 to 1, somewhere around there. And so he talks about how there's a drastic need for this kind of split of mix of people in academia specifically, and how we need to hear both sides of the argument and how that makes for the best ideas moving forward. And I just thought that was super ironic, considering that they made a point in this book at one point to be like, by the way, neither of the authors ever voted Republican ever. We have only ever voted or supported left-leaning or liberal, politicians since forever. And I was like, well, did you really then live by your teachings? Like, did you create a equal kind of melding of ideas and a, what did they call it? I have it right here. A mix of people for the mission? No, you didn't. If you are bragging about the fact that neither of you guys ever, that both of you guys have basically essentially been left-leaning for the entirety of your lives, then no, you didn't choose a mixture of people for the book that you created. And if the book is supposed to be kind of like an example of education, because it's an educational and it's a informational book, then you're not even living by the teachings that you espouse, the solutions that you espouse in this book. You should have, at least brought in either another partner or picked a partner that would have, espoused contrary maybe, or, a contrary view on some of these ideas. So I thought that was very kind of hypocritical, and I don't know, I didn't like that about the book. But that being said, these are some of the solutions that I did like about the book. So those were the two things that I didn't like about the book. Again, they felt like it's almost like apologetic and very like kind of milk toast, kind of like right down the middle of the aisle. And then, they didn't practice what they preach when they wrote this book, which is just kind of frustrating for me. So the solutions that I liked. The first one we already talked about: prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. I thought that was very good. 2, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. I thought that's a quote from Solzhenitsyn out of the Gulag Archipelago, which we already read this year. But ultimately, it talks about how every human can be good and evil at the same time, that no one is completely good or completely evil. Again, this, kind of combats this idea of, it's an us versus them mentality. And they just kind of go into that as like, we need to be constantly looking for the good and, the bad in everybody, that we can't go in wholeheartedly trusting somebody just because they're, ascribed to the same political party as us, but we also can't, be looking at the opposing political party and just say, oh, that person is 100%, Satan reincarnate. So the third one that they said is limit and refine device time. This was as far as like actionable items, this was probably one of the most actionable items. And they even, at one point in the book, they even give exact time limits. So they said for kids, I believe before like first or second grade, that you should try to limit individual screens, meaning like phones and iPads and things, almost to 0. And then after that, it should be, I can't remember the exact breakdown of ages, but at one point then they say, try to limit your screens to 2 hours or less per day. And I think that's at the peak that they get to. And so, again, I just like that there were very actionable items. They back, those items up with some data, some science, and, some studies that have been done about the effects of devices and social media on both adults, women, children, whatever it is, teenage girls, teenage boys. They back all of that up. And I thought that was a very, good reminder. Number 4 was entwine your identity with freedom of inquiry. I really like that. I think we should be very curious beings in general. I think that that's a very important thing. I feel like if you think you've got it all figured out, that is probably one of the worst mindsets to be in, that it's important to just hear opposing viewpoints. Again, most truth falls somewhere close to the middle of left and right, but not all left and not all right. And I think it's important that you continually explore ideas and that you evolve as an individual. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 was pick the best mix of people for the mission. I just laughed at this one again because they didn't even do that with this book. And then and this is not all of the solutions. These are just my favorite 6. And then number 6 was orient and educate for productive disagreement. And I thought that was good. They talk about the benefits of disagreement and how actually one of the things that they promote pretty heavily in this is debate, and how debate needs to be a focus within schools, and how we need to learn how to debate, and how to be, how to debate productively, and how to be able to hear and recognize other people's arguments, and just how to be able to look and dissect other people's arguments, and why debate and disagreement is ultimately actually productive and not something to be avoided. Disagreement should not be avoided completely. In fact, disagreement is usually the path towards some sort of agreement or reconciliation in the end. And so I thought that was really good. I really did enjoy kind of those points of the book. However, like I said, I felt like the book was a little weak, in my opinion. It was weak because of kind of this right down the middle, didn't want to offend one side or the other. They didn't really stick to their guns. They were constantly apologizing for things, and just overall trying to make this a book for everyone without, I don't know, because the ideas should be a book should already be for everyone. But they wanted it to be acceptable for, I don't even know what, I don't want to put thoughts into their minds, but ultimately that's the impression that I got over this book. So yeah, I mean, interesting. Like I said, if you haven't read this book, but you're interested in the overall premise, go ahead and search them on podcasts and search for them on interviews, because I feel like that is much more entertaining in my opinion. And you still get a good grasp of the entirety of their argument on those platforms. I don't think you really need to read this whole book, to be honest. It's a pretty forgettable book. It was pretty meh of a book. Overall, I'd say I'd probably give this book 2.5 stars. I'd give it a 2.5. I'd probably give it a 2-star, 1.5. No, I'd probably give it a 2-star. 2 stars for fun. Or engaging, I think is the word that Olivia said that I should use now. Not fun, but engaging. I think a 2 stars for engaging, and for importance, I'd give it a 5 star. So, I mean, it's definitely an important book. I think it's important concepts. I think there is a lot to be learned from here, but it's just meh. I think overall, I'd give it a 2.5. Not my favorite book, not my favorite execution of these ideas. However, definitely look them up. So if you haven't looked them up before, or ever heard of this book, look them up on other podcasts, because they are interesting individuals. And I think that the points that they bring up are very important. I think that they've only become more and more important since writing this book. And so it's just, definitely look them up. So thank you for listening to this episode of the Bookly Podcast. I'm hoping that this is one of the last kind of self-help-ish books that I read for a while, because I feel like we've had a couple of them back to back now and haven't really enjoyed them as much as other books. Again, loved East of Eden. I'm super excited for next week with the Poisonwood Bible. We have a lot of really good books coming up. So I think it's the Poisonwood Bible. Then it's Pride and Prejudice. No, Poisonwood Bible, Autobiography of Malcolm X, which I'm super excited for. Pride and Prejudice, and then after that is Red Sky Morning, but I think we're going to have to push that one back. So I'm going to have an announcement on my podcast. We're going to have to push back Red Sky Morning. That's the newest Jack Carr book, but he had to postpone the release date of the book. So because of the postponement of the release date, obviously I'm not going to be able to read it. So we're going to have to switch that out with a different book. So I'm going to have to move that back to whenever it comes out, but we're going to have a slight change in schedule. But other than that, the next couple of books I think are going to be really good. I'm really excited, and just be keeping up for any updates that we have on the Instagram. We're constantly posting updates on that. And if you're listening on YouTube, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to this video, and check out all of our episode trailer videos. Those are doing pretty good. Those have been super fun. Those are usually under 10 minutes is what I try to keep them. So somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes long, and they cover one idea or one, I don't know. I think the last one that I did was, something about the timeline of the Vietnam War. The time before that was how it should have ended for Dark Matter. They're just kind of fun videos. So make sure to check those out on YouTube. And then if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, make sure that you leave us a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends and read along with us. Like I said, the next couple weeks are going to be Poisonwood Bible, Autobiography of Malcolm X, Pride and Prejudice, and we're going to have to switch one out for Red Sky Morning. And then after that is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. So we've got some good books coming up. So make sure to read along, have fun with the podcast, and let us know what we can do to make the podcast any better. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.